can any nation on earth make the claim that it was conquered and exiled out of its ethnic homeland, not once, but twice, the second time for nearly 2,000 years, and yet found its way home again after that long exile? Only one nation on the earth can make the claim. I'll explain in this episode of the Prophetic Connection. We know from recorded history, and in fact from biblical history, that the nation of Israel suffered two major dispersions. The first occurred under the Babylonians, in fact under King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in 586 BC. This was the third phase of the conquering of Israel by Babylon, but it led to the expulsion of the Jews out of the land and into Babylon. The second dispersion occurred in AD 70 under the Roman Empire. And that second dispersion would last for nearly 2,000 years. In fact, Jesus as much as prophesied that this would happen. In Matthew 24, he was in Jerusalem with his disciples, and they drew his attention to the magnificent temple, the second temple refurbished by King Herod. But he, in his response, didn't seem to be that impressed. In fact, he said to them, as recorded in Matthew 24 in verse 2, "And Jesus said to them, to the disciples, 'Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down.'" We know that in AD 70 that prophecy was fulfilled, because the Romans not only conquered Jerusalem and the Holy Land, they destroyed that temple. They pulled the stones down one by one. And I filmed in front of the stones that are by the western wall of the ancient city. And those stones had been above either part of the temple or the temple colonnades. And the Romans, in fact, did cast them down. Then they pulled plows over that many-acre site and then put salt on top of that so that nothing would grow there. They were trying to wipe out Jewish history on the Temple Mount, in Jerusalem, and in the Holy Land. But God had made promises to Israel. He made them after the first dispersion, when the prophets said they would return. Jeremiah said they would return after 70 years of exile. But God made more promises after the second exile under the Romans, that the Jews would return to their ancient homeland. Now, nearly 2,000 years passed before it occurred. But how did this fulfillment of prophecy occur after the Second World War and the systematic killing of some 6 million Jewish people in what was supposed to be Christian Europe? It can only be explained by the miracles of God and God keeping his promises through the Hebrew prophets.
By the end of the first century of the Christian era, these promises must have had a hollow ring to them. Jerusalem lay in ruins. The Jews had been forced into exile. While the Jews had suffered long under Roman oppression, the end of the kingdom occurred in stages. By 36 AD, Caligula had claimed the imperial throne and declared himself to be God. This meant that all subjects of Rome's imperial empire had to bow down and worship Caligula, whether pagans, Jews, or Christians. This set the stage for the violent confrontations which followed. Since Jews and Christians recognized only one God, Abraham's God, they were soon viewed as rebels and enemies of the empire. Matters quickly deteriorated when in 64 AD, the Roman procurator Florus seized the gold from the temple treasury in Jerusalem. His actions provoked riots in the streets of the Holy City and became a trigger event for even more uprisings throughout the country. But this insurrection could not tolerate for long. It was a direct challenge to Roman rule and prompted a determined and violent Roman response. Titus, with 12 legions under his command, half the empire's military strength, was sent to crush the rebellion. Mass slaughter of Jerusalem's citizenry quickly followed. Men, women, and children alike were put to the sword. In the end, the city itself was destroyed, as was the sacred temple, what had been for more than 1,000 years the focal point of Jewish worship and the cherished heart of the nation. Not one stone of the temple was left standing upon another.
As I mentioned earlier, the second Jewish exile that occurred in AD 70 lasted 1,878 years, from AD 70 until 1948, with the rebirth of Israel in the modern era. But how on earth did the Jewish people survive as a Jewish nation? How did they retain their Jewish identity down through nearly 2,000 years of scattering and persecution among the nations? Well, some have suggested that this holy book kept them, even as they kept the holy book. The first 5 books of the Bible are known as the Law of Moses, the Torah, so to speak. And the laws of Moses, 613 in all, include many things: diets, a manner of living, dress codes, moral, ethical codes, and in also the Jewish feasts that God gave Israel, the rhythm of the Jewish year, the spring feasts and the fall feasts. Now, Jewish children had to learn to read and write early in life. If they were to understand Torah, the law of Moses, then they had to be able to read and to receive instruction about the law of Moses. So there are those who say that in keeping the book, the law of Moses, the book in turn kept them, and that helped them to retain their Jewish identity wherever they went. But it was at the same time a mark on them because they stood apart from the rest of society, wherever they were among the nations. In keeping the law of Moses, in maintaining their Jewish traditions, they were resisting being assimilated into the nations, but it also kept them apart, and almost everywhere they went, it led to their persecution because they never quite fit in. And the nations in which they found themselves never saw them as quite fitting in, trying to merge with the existing cultures. So they were then isolated and persecuted. And of course, in Europe during the Second World War, that led to the ghetto system and led to disease and death and mass killing of the Jewish people. But God had made promises to Israel that they would one day return to the Holy Land. And they must have seemed like empty promises, especially during the European Holocaust, when they were being killed all the day long, day after day after day, in gas chambers and extermination ditches. But still, God had promises to keep concerning Israel.
The Jewish inhabitants of the Holy Land, along with their early Jewish Christians among them, were uprooted from their sacred city and from the Promised Land, being scattered throughout the known world. However, not all would go quietly. Nearly 1,000 Jews held on in one last stand against the Romans, in a fortress near the Dead Sea.
It can perhaps be said that the Jewish nation collectively has suffered more than any other nation on earth. We can examine the history of the centuries, the scatterings, the 2 major dispersions, and being driven out of country after country because of their Jewishness. And then all of this culminating in the Second World War, when in Europe, what was supposed to be Christian Europe, they were placed in concentration camps. They were concentrated where the Nazis could control them, and then they were exterminated in those camps at the same time. If disease didn't kill them, then it would be the machine gun or the gas chamber. And yet, down nearly 2,000 years since AD 70 and the second major dispersion of Israel out of the land, surely God's unseen hand was with them. He didn't protect them from all suffering, but he sustained them through the water, through the fire. And we would have to say that because we can look now from the perspective of history and see that Israel is a nation again in her ethnic homeland, after a dispersion, exile that lasted 1,878 years. But the journey is far from over, and the persecution has not ended either. We saw this on October 7, 2023. We saw the slaughter that occurred in the Israeli communities that border the Gaza Strip. And we would have thought that what happened during the Second World War should have been an end to Jewish suffering, but sadly in the 21st century, it continues as before. But if there is a silver lining in all of this, it is the promises of God to Israel. I'm thinking of what Jeremiah said in chapter 31, that as long as the sun shines by day, the moon and the stars by night, Israel shall remain. And we could say that there are battles ahead, there is suffering ahead, but there is at the same time the sovereign will of an almighty God who calls himself the God of Israel and who has promised to be with Israel for perpetual generations and to allow them to live in the homeland. He promised them in the first place through Abraham, the man he called, to begin this very special nation that would be a blessing to all nations.
The Jews had become a people without a homeland, while the land they had called home was virtually without people. How then could God's promises to Abraham and his descendants be fulfilled? The only possibility was that the Jews, in their exile, would somehow cling to their ethnic and biblical roots, even as they patiently waited for that day when a sovereign God would summon them home and out of their exile among the nations. While Roman military might had robbed the Jews of virtually everything they valued, their freedom, their land, their sacred temple, Rome failed to erase the Jewish identity. Jews remained Jews wherever they were, even in exile. And wherever they went, they carried with them and cherished the sacred texts that reminded them who and whose they were. Jewish scribes had carefully recorded the history of Israel's relationship with God. They had preserved the laws God had revealed to Moses and the secrets given to their prophets. These would remind them of their past and point to their future. The Jews kept the Bible, and the Bible in turn kept the Jews. Its sacred texts, which included a rhythmic year marked by a series of feasts God had given Moses, set the Jews apart from the other nations. Specifically speaking, the people of Israel were to keep appointed feasts of the Lord. One of these, called the Sabbath, was also listed among the Ten Commandments. The Sabbath was to begin at sundown on Friday evening and end at sundown on Saturday. It was to be a day of rest, reflection, and reverence for God. During this time, the Jewish people could sing, study scripture, or pray, but not work. They were commanded to rest one day out of 7. Ironically, if not providentially, Jews in the diaspora, the dispersion, did their best to faithfully observe the feast of the Lord as instructed by Moses.
Today, more than ever before, it seems as though our world is at a tipping point as generation after generation slips further into chaos and darkness. Not since the days of Noah has the earth seen such decadence, immorality, and violence. But what does this mean for those who believe? and what consequences await for those who do not. As it was in the days of Noah, the DVD series of Dr. John Tweedie's 21st season of The Prophetic Connection explores the scriptures to uncover the meaning behind the signs of these troubled times. Call the number on your screen now, 1-888-206-1986, or visit C4IAmerica.com to become a new monthly partner with your gift of just $25 a month or more, and you will receive this DVD set, ideal for individuals or small group studies, along with the bi-monthly newspaper, Israel the Prophetic Connection. We're waiting to hear from you.
You know, I've been going to Israel for more than 40 years. My wife and I, with another couple, made our first visit to Israel in 1980. So we saw it way back then. And we've watched Israel's progress all over these more than 40 years. I mean, the first time we went to Jerusalem, there were donkeys and camels in the street. Not many, but some. Go today and you will not see donkeys or camels in the streets of Jerusalem. You'll find them perhaps on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the holy city, but they're there for the benefit of the tourists. And of course, the camel drivers or the man with the donkey will allow you to take a photograph with his animal, and of course, he'll expect something in return. Now, if you go to the desert places down by Jericho, for example, you will see lots of camels and donkeys, and in fact, you'll see shepherds, just as they were in biblical times. But Israel is a transformed nation. It is amazing to think, in fact, to see what has happened to this tiny nation since 1948 with its rebirth in the modern era. And even its return to the homeland, the Holy Land, is a miracle in itself. It cannot be explained any other way than the hand of God moving according to his timetable and bringing his people home. Now, this rebirth of Israel in 1948 occurred after 1,878 years of exile among the nations, and that was triggered by the dispersion of the Latin diaspora when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70 and with it the Great Temple, and then basically forced the Jews out of the country. Another dispersion occurred in 135 AD under the Roman Emperor Hadrian. So for all the centuries, the Jews were scattered among the nations, and yet most of them retained their Jewish identity. Some were assimilated, but the majority not. And they passed down their Jewishness from generation to generation. And how did they manage to remain Jewish, the chosen nation, that could then go back to the Holy Land when the time was right under a sovereign Almighty God? I think the answer is in the fact that they kept the book, as it is called, the Law of Moses, the 613 laws that Moses received from the Lord. That was to be Israel's identity, the way she should live, God's ethical and moral standards, the rhythm of feasts that God gave them, that was their calendar year according to the Jewish calendar. And all down through the centuries, the Jewish people, wherever they were, did what they could to keep the law of Moses, and they certainly kept the rhythm of the feasts in the year. Now, when we read Leviticus 23, and here we see the wisdom of God in giving the Jewish people the feasts in the first place. But here is what God said to Moses, Leviticus 23, verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts." So let me emphasize that. God is saying, they're not your feasts, even though I'm asking you to keep them. They are, first of all, and finally, my feasts that you're going to keep. And then the weekly Sabbath. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. And I've said in other seasons and other episodes, it's an amazing thing to be in Israel on Friday afternoon, because a holy hush, especially Jerusalem, a holy hush comes over the city. And I've been there filming on Fridays, and suddenly Jewish buses stop running. most Jewish people park their vehicles. The airline of Israel stops flying on the Sabbath. So here we are in the 21st century, and a nation is keeping this commandment that God gave them. Verse 4 of Leviticus 23. These are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. On the 14th day of the first month, at twilight, it is the Lord's Passover. So Passover begins what are called the spring feasts, and then later we will come to the fall feasts. And right after that, and the very next day, verse 6, and on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread, bread without yeast. So the commandments are very specific. And we continue. We've seen two of the feasts, Passover and unleavened bread. But then we come to the feast of first fruits in verse 9. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give to you and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. So notice how these feasts and these commandments, instructions being given to the people of Israel, connect them to the Lord. They're recognizing God when they do these things exactly as he intended. Verse 15 is, we come to the Feast of Weeks. And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. You shall offer a new grain offering to the Lord. Now, the end of this feast of weeks, as it is called, is synonymous with our Pentecost in our Christian tradition. And then we come to the Feast of Trumpets in verse 23, which is the beginning of the Jewish New Year. And then following that, we have the Day of Atonement. And we read in verse 26, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, also the 10th day of this 7th month shall be the Day of Atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you. You shall afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. And you shall do no work on that same day, for it is the Day of Atonement, to make atonement for you before the Lord your God. Now, this Day of Atonement is also known as Yom Kippur. It's a day of a reflection for Israel. Now, in biblical times, when the temple stood in Jerusalem, the high priest of Israel would put on his sacred garments. He would wear like a bishop's hat, like a mitre, and it was engraved on front, and it said, Holiness to the Lord. And having done adequate preparation, he would enter through the front door of the temple. He would be in the holy place, as it is called. In front of him would have been a veil separating from the holy place from the most holy place. And beyond that veil, in that sacred room, the Holy of Holies, stood the Ark of the Covenant, and above it, the mercy seat. And on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the high priest, having sacrificed animals, would sprinkle blood on the mercy seat. He was making atonement for the sins of Israel and representing them before the presence of Almighty God. And when he would leave that temple, then the people would realize that he is God's representative to them. Now, they could do that while the temple stood in Jerusalem. Today they cannot, but they still observe this special day, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Then we come to the last feast in the rhythm of the year, known as the Feast of Tabernacles. Verse 33 of Leviticus 23. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of the 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days to the Lord. So this ends the rhythm of the Jewish feast in any given year. It's interesting that the prophet Zechariah in chapter 14 speaks about the Feast of Tabernacles as a far future event. In fact, after the Messiah comes, the nations will be required to come to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Messiah. They'll have free will in this. If they come, they'll be blessed. If they don't, There will be curses over their nations because they haven't come to worship the Lord. I won't take time to read that or explain it more than that, but simply to say it's the one feast that carries on into the future, that one day all nations will worship the Messiah, the King, in the holy city of Jerusalem. This is God's plan. This is God's purpose. Now, I share this about the feast to explain this. When we speak about the destruction and dispersion of Israel, and we ask the question, how on earth did the Jewish people find their way home after 1,878 years of exile among the nations? How did they retain their identity and not be fully assimilated into the other nations? The key is in the commandments that God gave, and certainly in the feast that God gave Israel, because every generation of Jews down through the centuries has observed the feast to the extent they were able, not having a temple in Jerusalem, in fact, not even being in the Holy Land. So in a sense, by keeping the feast kept them. We've said the same about the Torah, the law of Moses. They kept the law of Moses, and the law of Moses kept them because they retained their Jewish identity. Now, that also was the means of persecution through the centuries. But nevertheless, when the rebirth of Israel occurred in 1948, God began to summon his people home. But he'd been calling them home earlier than that, but they came in ever larger numbers after 1948. And modern Israel can only be explained as the intervention of God, the miracle of God, the sovereign God keeping his promises to Israel. Now today, in the 21st century, they're being persecuted again, and we see that over and over. And anti-Semitism has risen remarkably in places that surprise all of us, even the level of universities and university campuses, and there are protests against Israel. But I would say this, what God has done in the past for Israel, he will do in the future. He's a covenant-keeping, promise-keeping God. He can do no other than to keep his promises to his chosen nation. And they will be there to welcome their Messiah when he comes back to Israel, to Jerusalem, one of these days.
This past year has been incredibly challenging, from the attacks on Israel to the ongoing struggles faced by the Jewish people worldwide. We've seen heartache, loss, and resilience like never before. Yet in the midst of these trials, C4I has been a source of hope and support in the Holy Land, providing aid, comfort, and a tangible reminder that they are not alone. Your generosity makes this life-changing work possible. Your one-time gift of just $25 or more helps us continue this vital mission. And as a thank you for your support, you will receive the bi-monthly newspaper Israel the Prophetic Connection, filled with stories and articles keeping you informed and up to date on all that is happening in Israel. Call now, 1-888-206-1986, or visit c4iamerica.com to make your one-time donation. Together, we can make a difference for the people of Israel.